There is a specific, quiet terror that resides in the hearts of the most accomplished among us, a haunting suspicion that every accolade received is a clerical error waiting to be corrected. This is the overachiever's paradox, where the higher you climb the ladder of success, the more you feel like a thief who has broken into a room where they do not belong. We call this imposter syndrome, yet it is far more than a mere psychological quirk or a temporary bout of nerves. It is a profound cognitive and spiritual crisis that occurs when our internal map of reality fails to align with the external territory of our achievements. To navigate this internal landscape, one must be willing to descend into the quiet chambers of the mind where these shadows dwell. As we begin this journey together within the community of the elevated within, we invite you to anchor yourself in this exploration of the self and the structures of the soul. By seeking a deeper understanding of our shared human architecture, we find the strength to dismantle the scaffolding of fear that keeps us from our true potential. This pursuit of inner mastery is not just about feeling better, but about seeing more clearly the nature of our own existence. At the root of this crisis lies what cognitive behavioral therapy identifies as a core belief, a foundational script that whispers of inherent inadequacy. When you believe at your center that you are fundamentally flawed, every success becomes a threat because it increases the distance between who you are and who the world thinks you are. To protect this fragile secret, you develop compensatory strategies, such as pathological overworking or preemptive self-sabotage, designed to keep the world from looking too closely. You become a prisoner of your own excellence, trapped in a feedback loop where even the most glowing praise is discarded through the filter of discounting the positive. This cognitive distortion acts as a psychological immune system that rejects the very evidence that could heal you. When someone commends your brilliance, your mind immediately reclassifies it as luck, timing, or a result of their own poor judgment. You are essentially gaslighting yourself, maintaining a narrative of fraudulence despite a mountain of objective proof to the contrary. This relentless effort to maintain a mask of mastery creates a state of perpetual high alert, draining the cognitive energy you need to actually perform the tasks you are so worried about failing. While modern psychology helps us map the mechanics of this internal critic, Lao Tzu offers a lens that looks through the critic and into the nature of the self. In the Taoist tradition, imposter syndrome is seen as the inevitable friction that occurs when we try to inhabit a false self. We suffer because we are attempting to project the image of a static winner, a fixed point of perfection that can be measured and validated by others. We have forgotten that the Tao teaches us we are not nouns to be defined, but a changing process that is constantly unfolding. In the eyes of the sage, the imposter is simply someone who has mistaken their social mask for their true essence. When you try to be a genius or an expert, you are creating a rigid identity that must be defended at all costs, which creates an unbearable weight of expectation. Lao Tzu suggests that the tension we feel is the result of forcing our nature into a shape it was never meant to hold. We are trying to be the mountain when we should be the mist that moves around it, clinging to a title while losing the flow of the moment. The synthesis of these two ancient and modern disciplines provides a complete architecture for liberation. Cognitive behavioral therapy provides the surgical tools necessary to dismantle the specific lies the ego tells us about our worth. It allows us to look at the evidence of our lives with a cold, objective eye and strip away the distortions that keep us small. By identifying the specific thoughts that trigger our feelings of fraudulence, we can begin to see the imposter as a collection of bad habits rather than a fundamental truth. However, once the lies are dismantled, we must find a new way to exist that does not rely on the constant monitoring of our own performance. This is where the concept of wu wei, or effortless action, enters the frame to provide the state of being that replaces the noise of the ego. If the therapy clears the brush and levels the ground, the Tao is the path that opens up once the obstacles are gone. We move from a state of trying to be someone to a state of simply doing what needs to be done, free from the burden of the observer. This integration allows us to bridge the gap between our psychological health and our spiritual peace. We no longer need to convince ourselves that we are great. Instead, we realize that the very category of greatness is a distraction from the work itself. When we stop trying to prove our existence to an invisible audience, we find that our hands move with a precision and grace that was previously blocked by our anxiety. The mask falls away not because we have perfected it, but because we no longer have any use for a disguise in a world where we are finally at home. The first movement in this dismantling requires us to become objective observers of our own internal prosecutor. This is the practice of thought catching, a deliberate pause where we intercept the narrative of fraudulence before it takes root in our identity. When you receive a promotion or a public acknowledgement of your skill, notice the immediate, reflexive contraction of the mind that tries to explain it away. By documenting these specific triggers in a formal thought record, you transform an overwhelming emotional storm into a series of manageable sentences on a page. This act of externalization begins to strip the critic of its perceived authority, turning a haunting ghost into a mere collection of habits. With the script finally visible, we apply the cold logic of Socratic questioning to every claim the internal critic makes. We must demand to see the objective evidence for our alleged fraudulence, distinguishing between the visceral feeling of incompetence and the measurable reality of our performance. This process exposes the emotional reasoning error where we assume that because we feel like a failure, we must truly be one. We begin to see how we have selectively filtered our history, magnifying every minor mistake while dismissing years of consistent progress as mere luck. This rigorous interrogation forces the ego to confront the fact that its narrative is built on a foundation of cognitive distortions rather than facts. Intellectual understanding is only the beginning. The true shift occurs when we engage in behavioral experiments that challenge our safety behaviors. These are small, intentional exposure tasks where we allow ourselves to be imperfect in low-stakes environments to see if the predicted catastrophe actually occurs. You might choose to send a message without a second proofread or share an unfinished idea during a brainstorming session. The purpose is to demonstrate to your nervous system that your value and your security are not tied to a flawless performance. These tiny acts of rebellion prove that the armor of perfection was actually a cage, and that you can survive and even thrive while being humanly flawed. As we master these interventions, we notice a profound change in our psychological landscape, yet a subtle tension remains. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an exceptional tool for silencing the noise and correcting the errors of the mind, but it often leaves us in a state of high-maintenance vigilance. We find ourselves constantly monitoring our thoughts, debating our fears, and managing our internal dialogue with a tiring level of effort. This creates a vacuum where the anxiety has been managed, but the spontaneous joy of action has not yet returned. We have repaired the instrument, but we are still so focused on the mechanics of the strings that we have forgotten how to play the music. This effortful monitoring is the final hurdle of the psychological approach, a point where the analytical mind has done all it can do. We are no longer drowning in the narrative of being an imposter, but we are still standing on the shore, overanalyzing every step we take toward the water. The cognitive tools have cleared the path of debris, yet the act of walking still feels like a calculated performance rather than a natural movement. We find ourselves trapped in a loop of self-correction, where the very act of trying to be healthy becomes another form of striving. It is here, at the edge of our psychological mastery, that we must look toward a different kind of wisdom to find true stillness. To move beyond this state of constant self-management, we must address the fundamental friction that exists whenever the ego tries to control the outcome of its own existence. The therapeutic process has shown us that our thoughts are not always true, but it has not yet shown us how to live without the need to constantly check them. We are still operating under the assumption that we must steer our internal world with an iron will to keep it from falling back into chaos. This reliance on willpower is a form of internal forcing that eventually leads to burnout and a renewed sense of inadequacy. We need a way to transition from the labor of fixing the self to the grace of simply being. The limits of the psychological model reveal a deeper longing for a state of being where the self and the action are no longer separate. While we have learned to argue with the critic, we have not yet learned how to let the critic disappear entirely into the background of our awareness. This requires a shift from the active intervention of the mind to the quiet observation of the spirit. We are standing at the threshold where the work of the therapy ends and the realization of the sage begins. The path forward is not found in more thinking or more analyzing, but in the radical surrender to a rhythm that does not require our permission to flow. This rhythm is found in the ancient Taoist principle of Wu Wei, a concept that is frequently misunderstood as a call to passivity or a justification for doing nothing. In reality, Wu Wei is the art of effortless action, a state where our behavior is so perfectly aligned with the natural order that it requires no conscious striving or internal debate. Consider the way a river navigates a landscape, flowing around massive boulders and through narrow canyons without ever pausing to plan its route or doubt its direction. The river does not try to be powerful or attempt to reach the ocean through sheer force of will. It simply responds to the terrain with a fluid grace that eventually wears down the hardest stone. This is the essence of the path we are exploring, a way of moving through the world where the friction of the self is finally removed from the machinery of our work. When we exist in a state of Wu Wei, we are no longer fighting against the current of our own existence or trying to manufacture a version of ourselves that meets the approval of others. In contrast, the state of UI, or forced action, is where the imposter syndrome thrives, as it represents a desperate attempt to control perceptions and engineer outcomes. We suffer because we are trying to force our lives into a specific shape, obsessing over whether we look the part of the expert or the leader. This constant grasping for validation creates a profound internal resistance, much like a swimmer who thrashes against the water and begins to sink under the weight of their own effort. By embracing non-striving, we stop trying to manage the image of our success and instead allow the success to be a natural byproduct of our presence. The ego acts as the primary source of this friction, functioning as a rigid filter that interprets every moment through the lens of self-preservation. In the grip of imposter syndrome, we are perpetually engaged in a form of spiritual theater, performing a role that we fear we haven't actually earned. This performance is an act of forcing, a calculated attempt to bridge the gap between our internal feelings of inadequacy and the external expectations of the world. Lao Tzu suggests that the more we try to define ourselves and protect our reputations, the further we drift from the source of our true power. When we stop trying to be someone significant, we find that we have the energy to do things that are truly significant, free from the paralyzing fear of being exposed as a fraud. To reach this state of freedom, we must return to what the Taoists call Piyu, the uncarved block, which represents our original nature before it was shaped by labels and social definitions. The uncarved block is powerful precisely because it is simple and unnamed, existing as a state of pure potential that does not need to defend a title or uphold a legacy. When you view yourself as an expert or a genius, you create a fragile identity that is constantly under threat by the possibility of a mistake. If you return to the simplicity of the uncarved block, you realize that there is no expert to be found out and no genius to be debunked. You are simply a human being engaged in a process, and without the heavy burden of a label, the anxiety of the imposter has nothing to cling to. This radical simplicity allows for the emergence of a skillful flow where the boundary between the doer and the deed begins to dissolve. Mastery is not achieved through the accumulation of more self-consciousness, but through the total disappearance of the self into the activity at hand. If you are a designer who is constantly worried about whether your work is good enough to prove your worth, your attention is split between the canvas and your own ego. In the state of Wu Wei, the designer vanishes, and there is only the movement of the brush and the emergence of the form. The shift from I am doing to doing is happening is the ultimate cure for the feeling of fraudulence, because the ego that would feel like an imposter is no longer present to claim the experience. When the self is set aside, we move with a precision that was previously blocked by the static of our own self-evaluation. We find that our skills are more accessible and our intuition is sharper because we are no longer wasting cognitive resources on monitoring our own performance. The fear of failure is replaced by a deep, quiet engagement with the present moment, where every challenge is met with a spontaneous and appropriate response. We are no longer performing for an audience, even the audience inside our own heads, but are instead participating in the natural unfolding of our own potential. This is the true meaning of inner mastery, not the perfection of a mask, but the realization that the mask was always an unnecessary weight on the soul. The integration of these two paths begins the moment a thought of inadequacy arises in the heat of a high-stakes moment. We use the cognitive lens to identify the specific distortion, effectively clearing the brush of irrational fears that tangle our feet and cloud our vision. Once the mental landscape is leveled through this rigorous questioning, we do not fill the space with new, positive affirmations that require constant upkeep. Instead, we step into the clearing and allow the principles of effortless action to open the path forward. This is the real-time synthesis, using the mind to silence the mind, creating a vacuum that nature then fills with spontaneous movement. As this practice matures, your professional life ceases to be a series of tests to be passed and becomes a fluid dance to be inhabited. You stop looking for evidence of success or external markers of validity because your focus has shifted from the outcome to the quality of your presence. In this state, you are no longer checking your performance against a hypothetical standard of perfection that exists only in your imagination. You are checking for alignment with the immediate demands of the moment, ensuring that your energy is flowing where it is needed rather than being trapped in self-reflection. The heavy burden of being an expert is replaced by the lightness of being a responsive instrument. There is a profound paradox at the heart of this mastery. By letting go of the desperate need to be competent, you inadvertently become more competent than ever before. When you are no longer wasting cognitive energy on self-monitoring or managing the internal narrative of fraudulence, that reclaimed power is funneled directly into the task at hand. Your brain is freed from the heavy overhead of maintaining an image, allowing your innate skills to operate at their highest natural frequency. You are not striving for a goal. You are simply removing the internal friction that prevents the goal from being realized. This is the ultimate efficiency of the soul, where the absence of the self leads to the perfection of the work. Living in this synthesized flow transforms the very nature of your daily experience from a struggle into a metamorphosis. You move through high-pressure environments with the same ease as a master craftsman at a workbench, because you have recognized that the pressure is an artificial construction of the ego. The internal critic may still offer its commentary from time to time, but you treat it like the distant sound of wind, a background noise that has no bearing on your current direction. You are no longer a person trying to convince a room of your worth. You are the room itself, holding the space for whatever needs to emerge. This is the state where the distinction between the worker and the work dissolves into a singular, graceful movement. This transition requires a radical trust in the processes you have spent years developing, allowing them to function without the interference of your conscious will. When you trust the Tao of your own training, you find that the right words and the right actions emerge exactly when they are required. You stop rehearsing for life and start living it, realizing that the most effective version of yourself is the one that isn't trying to be anything at all. This is not a loss of ambition, but a refinement of it, where your drive is no longer fueled by the fear of being found out, but by the joy of seeing what your nature can produce. You become a witness to your own excellence, observing your capabilities with the same detached wonder you might feel while watching a sunset. The long-term application of these principles creates a psychological resilience that is unshakable because it is not built on the shifting sands of achievement. You begin to see every challenge not as a threat to your identity, but as an opportunity to practice this state of non-striving. Even when mistakes occur, they are no longer viewed as evidence of fraudulence, but as natural ripples in the water that eventually return to stillness. This perspective allows you to take risks that were previously unthinkable, as the fear of failure loses its power when there is no ego-driven image to protect. You are finally free to explore the full breadth of your potential, unencumbered by the ghost of the person you thought you had to be. In the end, you realize that the imposter and the expert were both just stories you told yourself to feel safe in an unpredictable world. By dismantling the lie with logic and embracing the truth with silence, you reach the state where you are simply the doer at peace with the doing. You are finally home within yourself, and the work you produce is merely the shadow cast by your internal light. If you are ready to continue this journey into the depths of your own potential, subscribe to the Elevated Within and join us as we explore the architecture of a truly liberated life.